This is a spoken narration of my essay titled, You Can't Light the Fire and Then Complain About the Heat: The Psychology of Regret, Denial, and Self-Inflicted Harm. If you'd like to read along or revisit the written version, there's a link to the full text at the top of the episode description. Let's get started. You can't light the fire and then complain about the heat: the psychology of regret, denial, and self-inflicted harm. There's a peculiar thing happening right now. People who voted for chaos are suddenly surprised to find themselves living in it. The same voters who cheered on promises to dismantle, to defund, to silence, to purge, are now confused, outraged, even frightened, as those very promises are kept. Programs they depend on are vanishing. Jobs they once assumed were untouchable are being swept aside. Academic freedoms they never imagined would be threatened are now under attack. And still, many of them say, I didn't think he meant me. And that's the crux of it, isn't it? This is not a political essay. It's a psychological one. Because underneath the headlines and policies lies something far older and more enduring than any administration: the human mind's capacity to distort, deny, and deflect reality in the service of self-protection. What we are witnessing, as some Americans complain about the very outcomes they once applauded, is not simply hypocrisy, it is a cognitive dissonance in its rawest form. It is motivated reasoning dressed up as victimhood. It is the tragedy of people lighting the fire and then screaming about the heat. It would be easy to mock, tempting for some even. There is something viscerally satisfying about watching people face the consequences of decisions they refused to think through. But psychology reminds us that mockery doesn't fix anything. It deepens denial. And denial, when collective and reinforced, becomes cultural. This piece is for those who are confused by what they're seeing. It's for those who feel the weight of watching their fellow citizens demand empathy after endorsing cruelty, who are trying to reconcile how someone can vote for harm and then grieve it when it arrives at their own door. It's also for those who are waking up to what they voted for and are wrestling with the shame that realization brings. And yes, it's for the ones still deep in the echo chamber, hoping this might be the crack in the glass. Human beings are wired for stories that protect our sense of self. We will revise memory, reject facts, and rationalize contradictions if it means we don't have to say the hardest words in the English language. I was wrong. But being wrong isn't the end of the story. It can be the beginning of something far more human: insight, growth, and repair. Well, that is, if we're willing to face it. In the pages ahead, we'll look closely at how this pattern unfolds, how people ignore warnings they fully understood, why they support policies that punish them, how they become both perpetrators and victims of political harm, then retreat into grievance when reality catches up. We'll examine the psychological mechanisms of denial, identity preservation, and moral disengagement, and we'll ask what it costs a society when its citizens lose the ability to own their choices. I want to be very clear here, friends. This is not about blame. It's about understanding. But understanding does not mean excusing. There is a difference between compassion and enabling. And in a time when truth itself is under siege, we cannot afford to pretend that every opinion is equally grounded or that every complaint is equally valid. If you voted for the match, you don't get to act surprised by the burn. Let's begin.
Hello and welcome to The Psychology of Us with Professor RJ Starr, where we explore the mind's influence on life, relationships, and society. RJ Starr is an existential psychologist, professor, and author dedicated to exploring the core challenges of human existence, how we find meaning, embrace responsibility, and navigate life's challenges. Known for a thought-provoking yet accessible approach, RJ inspires listeners to cultivate self-awareness, emotional intelligence, authenticity, and purpose. This podcast is designed for all psychology enthusiasts, practitioners, students, and anyone curious about why we think, feel, and behave the way we do. Each episode unpacks theories, explores complex questions, and offers insights that deepen understanding of the human experience. So settle in, stay curious, and discover the psychology of us.
The comfort of denial. Why people ignore warnings they hear loud and clear. The idea that people were somehow misled, that they didn't know what they were voting for, doesn't hold up even under the lightest scrutiny. The promises were public, the threats were explicit, and the intentions were broadcast with pride. When a political figure announces plans to gut social programs, silence dissent, and punish perceived enemies, and then proceeds to do exactly that, it cannot be framed as bait and switch. It was a transaction, it was a declaration. And in many cases, it was a projection of personal fantasy onto a figurehead who reflected something deeper than policy: identity, revenge, or restoration. So how do people ignore what they were clearly told? That question isn't just political, it's psychological. Enter motivated reasoning, the brain's uncanny ability to interpret information in ways that protect what we already believe. When facts threaten our self-image, we don't usually abandon the belief. We distort the fact. We bend the reality to preserve the identity. People who voted for a leader who promised to punish institutions often told themselves, he won't go that far, or that's just him talking, that's bluster. The human mind is remarkably skilled at minimizing threats when the threat is coming from someone we support. That's not rational thinking, it's emotional survival. The cost, of course, is clarity. Then there's selective attention. When a political figure makes 30 statements in a speech, people will zero in on the one or the three that confirm their hopes and conveniently dismiss the 27 that indicate danger. It's not that they didn't hear the rest, it's that their minds filed them away as noise. Later, when those ignored statements become policy, the brain's only defense is confusion or denial. That's not what I voted for, they say. But it was. They just didn't let themselves see it. We also have to consider the role of confirmation bias, which makes people seek out only the information that aligns with their expectations. If someone believes a political leader is a savior, they will find news sources, voices, social groups that echo that belief. They will filter out critiques as lies or attacks, no matter how factually grounded. And when that echo chamber is reinforced daily, cognitive flexibility disappears. What's left is belief, hardened, defensive, and impervious to contradiction. Psychologically, this is what happens when identity becomes more important than information. People don't just vote with their minds, they vote with their wounds, their fears, their desires. And if a candidate speaks to those emotional places, supporters will ignore nearly everything else. This is why someone can hear a policy that objectively harms them and still say, I trust him. Because the trust is not based on policy analysis, it's based on emotional resonance. What we're witnessing now is the unraveling of those distortions. People who believed they were safe from the harm now realize the fire is spreading in all directions. Medicaid cuts, job eliminations, academic censorships, attacks on public institutions. These are not abstract threats. They are real. And for some, the illusion is cracking. But instead of owning the choice that led here, many fall back on blame. The media didn't tell us, or no one warned us. But they were warned. They simply chose not to believe it. This is not about intelligence. Smart people can be emotionally misled. This is about psychology. And denial in all its forms is a potent sedative. It tells people what they want to hear, not what they need to face. Until reality breaks through, and that moment, when denial collapses under the weight of consequence, is what we're living through right now. It's uncomfortable, it's revealing, and it's only the beginning. Group identity over self-interest, how loyalty becomes a psychological trap. If denial is the doorway, identity is the lock. When people vote against their own material interests, it's tempting to label them irrational, but that misses the point. People don't vote solely based on policy spreadsheets or economic forecasts. They vote based on who they believe they are and who they believe they are not. In other words, they vote to protect their place in a group, even if it means sacrificing their personal well-being. That's not a bug in the system. That's group psychology at work. According to social identity theory, individuals define themselves by the groups they belong to: political, cultural, religious, regional. That identity gives them a sense of meaning, belonging, and purpose. When a political leader speaks to that identity, when they echo its values, its grievances, its vision of who the enemy is, they don't have to make sense on every issue. They simply have to say, "You belong with me." The group becomes the home. The vote becomes a declaration of loyalty. And once that loyalty is pledged, it's no longer about policy, it's about protection, not of the country, but of the self-concept rooted in group membership. This is why someone on Medicaid might vote for the very politician who promises to cut Medicaid. Because to vote for the other side would mean aligning with an outgroup that feels alien, condescending, or threatening. The fear of being seen as one of them, liberal, elite, academic, progressive, overrides the fear of personal loss. That fear is powerful, and it is stoked deliberately. Political rhetoric today doesn't merely debate ideas, it draws battle lines. It tells people they're at war with immigrants, with professors, with the media, with government workers, with their own neighbors. When someone is convinced that their group is under attack, they will do nearly anything to defend it, even if it means going hungry, even if it means losing health care, even if it means voting for a future that erodes their own safety. It's not logical. It's tribal. This is the trap of in-group loyalty. Once someone is inside the circle, anything that threatens the leader or the message feels like a threat to the group, and by extension, a threat to the self. So when critics raise alarms, they're not heard as concerned citizens. They're heard as enemies. That is why attempts to reason with deeply loyal supporters often fail. It's not that they lack comprehension. It's that they are defending a boundary, not analyzing a policy. There's also the psychological pressure of group cohesion. People want to stay connected to their families, churches, communities, and social networks. If everyone around them supports a particular candidate, it becomes psychologically costly to dissent. They risk ostracism, ridicule, or even abandonment, so they stay quiet, or they double down. Over time, they internalize the identity so deeply that it becomes difficult to imagine any other perspective is valid. This is how you end up with people saying things like, "I didn't think he would take away my benefits, just theirs." Because the belief is that the leader will protect us and punish them. That's how groupthink works. It creates a false sense of insulation where the consequences are always meant for someone else. But reality doesn't work that way. Reality doesn't care about identity. And when policy hits, it doesn't check who you voted for before it takes effect. The irony, of course, is that the same people who insisted government was the enemy are now begging for government protection. The same voices that demanded public institutions be gutted are now shocked that no one is left to answer the phone, process the forms, or enforce the rules, or send the checks on time. This isn't hypocrisy. It's the delayed awakening of a group identity that prioritized symbolic victory over structural stability. It's easy to mock, but what we're witnessing is a psychological unmasking. When people realize their group didn't protect them, that their loyalty was weaponized, and that the promises weren't made to uplift them but to use them, it creates a rupture. Some will cling tighter. Others will start to question. What happens next depends on whether the need for truth becomes stronger than the need to belong. When victimhood becomes a defense, the need to complain without owning the cause. There's a strange reversal playing out right now. People who voted to dismantle systems are crying out for support from the very systems they helped weaken. The same individuals who demanded that safety nets be slashed, that bureaucracies be gutted, and that power be centralized in one man's hands are now shocked to find themselves unsupported, unheard, and vulnerable. And many are not responding with self-reflection. They are responding with complaint. They are positioning themselves as victims of the very machine they helped build. This isn't just politics, this is classic psychology. In order to make sense of this, we need to talk about moral disengagement, the process by which people distance themselves from the harm they participate in. When individuals are involved in a decision that leads to pain, it's easier to deny that harm or reframe it than to take responsibility. This is called moral disengagement. So instead of saying, I voted for the policy that hurt me, they say, I didn't know, or this isn't fair. In doing so, they shift themselves from the role of actor to the role of target. It's not just denial, it's defensive victimhood. This happens when accountability feels too threatening to the ego. To say, I chose this and it hurt people, including myself, would require a collapse of identity, a confrontation with shame, and the courage to rebuild. Most people aren't taught how to do that. So they pivot, they complain, they search for someone else to blame. Often, that someone is abstract, the deep state, the media, the left, the elites. Rarely is it themselves. Psychologically, this is displacement. Displacement, taking the internal discomfort of being wrong and pushing it outward onto something else. It's also projection, where people assign their own internal conflicts to others. So when government programs fail after being defunded, people blame bureaucrats. When healthcare disappears, they blame immigrants. When freedoms are curtailed, they blame universities or activists. The truth that their own vote helped make it happen is too psychologically destabilizing. And yet, there's something especially galling about watching this play out in real time, because it's not just the refusal to take responsibility. It's the demand for compassion without a moment's recognition of complicity. It's a person saying this is unfair while ignoring the fact that they once cheered for that same unfairness to fall onto others. The policy that now affects them was once aimed at someone else. It only became a problem when the boomerang came back around. This is the psychology of what we call moral licensing, a subtle but dangerous form of rationalization. When people believe they are, quote, good people, end quote, they allow themselves to support bad things without guilt. A voter may say, oh, I just want stronger borders, or I want healthcare for my children, as a way of distancing themselves from the human cost. Or they may say, I was tired of the system, to justify the election of someone who promised to tear it down. The harm is written off as incidental, unfortunate, or unintended until it affects them. Then, and only then, does it become worthy of outrage. What makes this moment psychologically important is the scale of the reversal. People are not just grappling with bad outcomes, they are struggling with the shame of having supported them. But instead of processing that shame, many convert it into grievance, and that grievance becomes performative. Cries of betrayal, confusion, and victimization from people who once shouted, "Let it burn! Lock her up!" It's hard to listen to, but it's also revealing. At its core, this is about the human need to be innocent, to avoid the consequences of moral participation by claiming ignorance, powerlessness, or misdirection. But no one was misdirected. The goals were clear, the targets were named, the actions were promised, the cheering was loud, and the outcomes, predictably, are now here. The question is whether we are ready, as individuals and as a culture, to stop pretending we are victims of outcomes we chose. That shift, if it comes, requires not only honesty, but humility. And humility is in short supply when grievance feels more rewarding. The psychology of wanting a villain, why we punish ourselves just to hurt the other. When a person says they're willing to burn the whole thing down, They usually imagine they'll be spared from the flames. There's a certain fantasy in destruction, especially when it feels like payback. Many voters weren't looking for leadership, policy, or coherence. They were looking for vengeance. Someone to hurt the people they believe hurt them. And that impulse, while often described as populist rage or working class frustration, is more deeply rooted in something far more primal, the psychological need for a villain. In the mind of a disillusioned voter, the world is not complicated, it's divided. Good people versus bad people. Patriots versus traitors. Us versus them. That narrative is comforting because it provides direction. It tells them where to point their fear, their disappointment, their grief. It gives form to the chaos inside them. And so when a political leader steps up and names the villain, immigrants, the press, the Chinese, professors, federal employees, it feels like clarity. But what it really is, psychologically, is displacement. It is the redirection of inner turmoil toward an external target. This is the power of scapegoating. Rather than confront the reality of economic inequality, systemic failure, or social alienation, it's easier to find a face to blame, something familiar, something safe to hate. A professor who seems smug, a journalist who asks too many questions, a government worker with a pension, a protester, a woman who speaks up. These aren't enemies, they're symbols, and symbols are far easier to punish than problems are to solve. But here's where it turns. The desire to hurt the perceived other becomes so strong that people will accept self-destruction as collateral damage. They will support policies that weaken their own healthcare, education, labor protections, and community resources, as long as they believe those policies also punish the group they've come to resent. That's not political strategy, that's reactance, a psychological reflex that emerges when people feel their autonomy or identity is under threat. It says, I'd rather suffer than let you win. Reactance often masquerades as strength, but it's rooted in fear, the fear of irrelevance, of cultural displacement, of change. And when that fear is stoked relentlessly, strategically, by a leader who thrives on division, the emotional payoff of punishing the other begins to outweigh the rational consideration of what's actually being lost. The people cheering on the destruction of public institutions are often the very ones who depend on them most. But in the grip of grievance, they don't see that. They just want someone to pay. Psychologically, this is revenge fantasy masquerading as politics. The leader becomes an avatar for all the anger voters have ever been able to express. And once that emotional identification is made, reality becomes irrelevant. It doesn't matter if promises are kept. It doesn't matter if their lives improve. What matters is that the perceived enemy is humiliated, that the liberal tears are flowing, that we can own the liberals, that someone who once made them feel small is now being publicly shamed. It's not policy, it's performance. And the cost is enormous. Because what happens when the villain turns out to be fiction? When the immigrant neighbor is kind? When the journalist is right? When the government worker is your cousin? And what happens when the fire you set to hurt someone else burns your own house down? Psychologically, most people don't wake up in that moment. They double down. They convince themselves that it wasn't the fire. It was faulty wiring. It wasn't the policy. It was sabotage. Because to admit the truth would require confronting the real villain, their own choice. This is what makes the current era so volatile. We are living through a collapse of a revenge fantasy, and as it crumbles, the people who clung to it most tightly are not softening. They are hardening, because it is easier to blame than to rebuild. It is easier to sneer than to grieve, and it is easier to demand new villains than to reckon with old wounds. But reckoning is exactly what we need, not to shame, but to understand, not to mock, but to break the cycle. The only way to stop punishing ourselves in the name of punishing others is to step out of the illusion that politics is war and realize it's supposed to be stewardship. Until then, the fire will keep burning and no one, no matter how loyal, will be spared the smoke. The moral injury of watching people suffer by choice. There's a quiet kind of heartbreak that comes with watching someone suffer unnecessarily, especially when they were warned, when the outcome were predictable, when the consequences were not only visible but loudly announced. It's not the sadness of tragedy. It's the sadness of willful self-destruction. And when those same people then demand compassion, resources, and understanding after cheering for the very things that led them there, it creates something deeper than frustration. It creates moral injury. Moral injury is a term often used in trauma psychology, particularly in veterans or medical professionals. It describes what happens when someone witnesses, participates in, or is forced to accept behavior that violates their core values. It's not simply pain, it's disorientation, a sense that the world no longer makes sense because the lines between right and wrong have been blurred, denied, or even obliterated. Many people are feeling that now. Not because they lost a political contest, but because they're watching people who voted for harm now cry out as victims of it. People who supported policies designed to cut assistance, to suppress dissent, to punish the vulnerable, are now in need of assistance, are now facing silenced dissent. They're now becoming vulnerable. And rather than acknowledge their role in it, they're demanding empathy with no recognition of complicity. That is what makes the wound so hard to treat. Excuse me. Psychologically, it triggers something deep. It violates fairness. It violates the expectation that actions have consequences and that people bear responsibility for what they support. For those who still believe in reason, in ethics, in compassion that's grounded in accountability, this reversal feels not only unjust but surreal, as if we're being asked to tend to wounds that were self-inflicted with full knowledge of the blade. There is a special exhaustion that comes from this dynamic, where the person who lit the match expects you to help them put out the fire without acknowledging that they ever struck it. And the moral injury deepens when society obliges, when no one names the truth, when everyone is so afraid of offense that they let denial go unchecked. But part of the moral injury also comes from within, from the tension between our higher selves and our human responses. Because the truth is, we do feel for these people. Many of us were raised to care, to extend kindness, even to those who wouldn't return it. So when someone suffers, even if they brought it on themselves, there's a part of us that aches to help. But that part is now in conflict with another part, the one that says, enough. You knew, you were told, you chose this, own it. That inner conflict is psychological too. It's the battle between empathy and boundaries, between compassion and consequence. It's the friction between wanting to live by a moral code, and refusing to be a doormat for people who mistake cruelty for courage until it turns on them. And it's in that space between the impulse to care and the need to protect ourselves from manipulation that so many of us are trying to find a stable footing. Some respond with anger, others with numbness, some disengage entirely, but what they're all experiencing is a rupture, a break in the social contract that says we take care of each other, but we also tell the truth. You can't keep asking for help from the very systems you tried to destroy without some recognition of that hypocrisy. You cannot claim to be a victim of policies you helped implement without facing the discomfort of responsibility. Otherwise, the wound will never close, it will fester. And for those who are watching, for those trying to hold on to their sanity and principles in the face of all this cognitive dissonance, there is only so much they can bear. The anger isn't just political, it's psychological. It comes from the sense that the very fabric of shared reality is being torn apart by people who refuse to own what they have done. This is the toll of moral injury, not because bad things happen, but because they happen unnecessarily, predictably, and are then denied. And yet, the question remains, how do we respond? Do we meet the denial with contempt? Do we meet the victimhood with silence? Or do we meet it with a hard truth that might, if we're lucky, wake something up? Accountability is healing. Why ownership is the first step toward repair? There's a point in any recovery, personal or collective, where things don't get better until someone tells the truth. Not just any truth, but the hard one. The kind that demands ownership, the kind that doesn't flinch. And right now, in the context of a country watching people suffer from exactly the outcomes they voted for, that truth is this: there can be no healing without accountability. Psychologically, accountability is not about blame, it's about integration. It's the process of absorbing a difficult truth into one's self-concept and adjusting behavior accordingly. It's the opposite of denial. It requires humility, reflection, and the ability to say, I did this, I chose this, I helped create this. And from that place, not shame, but responsibility, real growth can begin. But we live in a culture that treats accountability like a threat. Somewhere along the line, we replaced maturity with defensiveness, reflection with deflection. People are more comfortable saying, I was misled, than I ignored what was right in front of me. More comfortable blaming the media, the system, or the elites than with recognizing and reckoning their own choices. This avoidance isn't harmless. It perpetuates the cycle. Because if there's no ownership, there's no interruption. And if there's no interruption, we just repeat the same pattern, reacting to pain without asking how we helped create it. That is how societies collapse, not all at once, but by refusing to learn. But the psychology of repair is clear. The brain can change, people can shift, and that process begins the moment someone steps out of the victim role and into the mirror. Accountability is the moment someone stops asking, why is this happening to me? And starts asking, what part did I play? That moment is sacred. It is the birthplace of integrity. Unfortunately, accountability is also deeply uncomfortable. It requires people to separate themselves from the groupthink that once made them feel safe, to say, I supported this and it was wrong. It's not just socially costly, it's identity threatening. It's the psychological equivalent of leaving a religion. And yet, it's the only way forward. So how do we get there? We stop enabling denial by pretending every opinion is rooted in fact. We stop softening the truth in the name of unity. We stop pretending that calling people out is mean when it's often the most respectful thing we can do. Because telling someone the truth, even when it's hard, is a vote of confidence in their capacity to grow. We also make space for people to change. We don't have to forget what they supported. We don't have to erase the damage done. But we can choose to engage with those who show signs of reflection. Not performative regret, not passive confusion, but real reckoning. That is the only kind of healing worth investing in. And for those watching from the outside, those who never wanted this, who tried to warn people, who are now being asked to help, we get to set boundaries. Compassion is not infinite, neither is emotional labor. It's okay to say, I'm willing to walk with you if you're willing to take responsibility. And it's okay to say, not until then. We are not required to hold hands with people who haven't even begun to face themselves, but we are called, at least occasionally, to tell the truth clearly enough that someone else might hear it. The great myth of this moment is that we're divided by politics. We're not. We're divided by psychology, by whether people can confront reality or whether they must keep twisting it to avoid pain. And until that divide is named addressed, we will stay locked in this cycle of harm and grievance, fire and denial. Accountability isn't cruelty, it is clarity. It is the only path out of the delusion, and it is not just necessary, it is overdue. We're in a moment where clarity is rare and comfort is cheap. People want reassurance more than reckoning, but psychology doesn't reward fantasy, it rewards truth. The truth is that we are watching the fallout of choices made in plain sight. And while it's human to seek comfort in denial, it is also human to wake up, to change, to rebuild. But that begins with the sentence too many still refuse to say, I was wrong. If we can make space for that sentence and demand it when it's due, we just might stop lighting fires we later expect others to put out.
That wraps up this episode of The Psychology of Us with Professor RJ Starr. Each conversation is a step toward greater understanding of ourselves, each other, and the forces that shape human behavior. Listeners are invited to continue the conversation by sharing their thoughts, questions, and topic suggestions at profrjstarr@outlook.com. Every message helps shape future episodes, ensuring the discussions remain relevant, thought-provoking, and meaningful. For those who find value in these explorations, subscribing and leaving a review is a great way to support the podcast and bring these insights to a wider audience. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and keep exploring the psychology of us.